Where does that ability come from? You just saying those words, I can only imagine. Where does that ability come from? How are you able to imagine what you would do in the presence of God? What is it? Well, part of it comes out of what we're going to look at today, and it's hope. It's your hope that helps us to imagine what it would be like to stand in God's presence. That same hope brings you here today. Why come to this place? Why are we here? We started this series last week looking at this word called cultivate. What does it look like to cultivate a culture? Culture is actually something that's very hard to define or articulate, and sociologists have kind of put it in the simplest terms that they can, and they said it's the narratives, it's the stories that we tell. It's a big part of what our culture is. It's the convictions that we hold. But it's also the practices. It's the things that we do that define what our culture is. But like many of you, we probably have a specific culture that we want to be or that we want to be a part of. But if we're not intentional about cultivating that culture that we want to have, then sky's the limit on what it could possibly turn into. So we have to be intentional. We have to put practice into, we have to put activity into cultivating this culture. So we looked last week about to cultivate soil, we have to prepare the ground. We have to determine what kind of soil that we have to determine what kind of seed would be best to put in the ground that we have. We have to take care of that ground. What nutrients do we need to put in? The water management that we have, the nutrient management that we have to put into the ground to prepare it for the harvest that we want to reap. There are so many things that go into preparing for the harvest. But you see, I believe that when a farmer puts something in the ground, they are not surprised when it comes time to reap the harvest. Have you ever met a farmer that said, I could have sworn I planted beans there? Probably not. They know exactly what they put in the ground. They know that field is going to be corn this year. They're planning on it. It's what they put in the ground. So let me ask you this. Do you know what you're going to harvest? Well, here's a good indicator. What are you putting in the ground? What are you putting in the ground? What are you cultivating in your life? That will tell you what you're going to reap in your harvest. In John 15, we see that Jesus tells us that we should bear fruit. That the fruit of our lives should resemble what it looks like to be a follower of Christ. In Galatians chapter 5, we see Paul tell us the fruits of the Spirit, what some of those things look like to be a follower of Christ, that you should have these characteristics in your life. And it doesn't say grumpy. That one's not there. It doesn't say depressed. It doesn't say pessimistic. those you will not find. So I informed you, if you did not already know last week, that the best apples are the Honeycrisp. And a close second are the Fuji apples. None of that mushy stuff. If I wanted applesauce, I would get it out of a can. So the Honeycrisp apple. We look at this, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know this came from an apple tree. I did not get this out of my garden because I planted it in the ground, and in the ground it formed an apple and I had to dig it up. Didn't happen. It came from an apple tree. What tree would the people around you say that you came from? Would it be the tree of Christ? Do people look at you and say, that is a Christian? Do people look at you and see the fruit that resembles a follower of Christ? So we talked about faith last week. But this week I want to talk about hope. Do you ever feel like something or someone took a bite out of your apple? You have this perfect faith. I know who God is. I know that God died and sent his son to die on the cross for me. I know that he forgives my sins, but there's just something about it that's missing. I was so happy. But there's something about the apple that's missing. And we look at our life and we say we're not happy with it anymore. The hope is gone, and this apple's really good. The hope that we once had, we feel like is missing. Well, first, what is hope? You see, we today define hope as a desire or a wish. We say, we hope you have a great day. Our desire is for you to have a great day. Our wish for you today is that you have a great day. But you see, in the Bible, we find that hope is used in that way the minority of the time. It's rarely used in that tense. Hope in the Bible that we find that is used predominantly, hope is used to define a trust, a confident expectation, or a solid assurance. Does it sound anything like what we think of it today? You see, when we say that we hope in God, it's saying we know, we are confident that God will come through. But is hope really the word that we mean? How easy is our confidence overcome? Or that thing that we were sure of, confidently assured that this was going to happen, and it didn't. So we started looking last week at the story of the Babylonians taking the Hebrew people into exile back to Babylon. And we looked at how the Israelites had been released to go back to Jerusalem to begin building the temple. Well, for 70 years, the Israelites were in exile in Babylon. 70 years they were taken away from their home. They weren't allowed to worship their God. They weren't allowed to burn the sacrifices on the altar to their God. No, none of that stuff. Kind of like China right now. You don't go and pray out in public. You don't take your Bible out in public and read it. Because it's not allowed. You get killed for doing that. It was okay that they were Jews because they took them from Jerusalem. They understood that, but don't practice. Don't live out your faith. They couldn't do that. For 70 years, do you think that their hope was a little shaken? Do you think that the assurance that they once had living in Jerusalem, being able to freely worship their God, do you think that that confidence had diminished? So how do we cultivate hope? How do we cultivate that today and every day? The first thing is that we need to count on opposition. Count on it. It's not a what if this happens. It's not a what if I have struggles. It's not what if I have pain in my life. Count on it. It's going to happen. So Zerubbabel returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. That was his mission. So he goes and he begins to rebuild the temple. He begins by creating an altar so that they could start worshiping their God right then before they did anything else. But as soon as they got the temple built, they started working on the foundation. And by that point, their good friends, the Samaritan neighbors, didn't want to be all that neighborly. And they begin to oppose the building of the temple because they knew that if the Israelites could worship their God, it would not be good for them in the future because of how strong their God was and how powerful he was. And that if his people were worshiping him again, times looked bleak for their future. So they began to oppose the building of the temple. The Samaritans write to the king in Persia. They send letters to the kings. The first letter they sent was to Xerxes. It says this in Ezra chapter 4, verse 12. It says, "The king should know that the people who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem." Lie, they were never going to them. They were always going to Jerusalem. "And are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes and tribute will be given, or duty will be paid, and eventually the royal revenues will suffer." You see how they're kind of pouring it on thick for the king? This is going to hurt you, king, if you don't do something about it. Now, since we are under obligation to the palace, and it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we are sending this message to inform the king so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records, you will find that this city is a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition. That is why the city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in the Trans-Euphrates. So being a good king, you want to make the wisest decision. So he goes and he looks through the Chronicles. He sends his reply. "The letter that you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of the Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. Now issue an order to these men to stop work, so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests? Stop them. Don't let them grow in power. Don't let them build their hope back again. We need to keep them down here so that they don't come and destroy us. Before long, they started rebuilding again. That's what we looked at Haggai last week, where he comes and he encourages them to rebuild, get back to work. He says that God is with you. And so they start building again, and so they send another letter, this time to King Darius. And they tell King Darius of all the things that the people were doing. And this is what they told us. They told us that King Cyrus said that they could come and they could do this. We think they're lying to us. Go back and check the Chronicles. Opposition again. I know one thing in my life that I'm confident of in my ministry and in my life. That I've learned this. And when I first said it, I never thought anything of it. But the more kind of I've lived my life of faith, I've realized that, wow, this was a pretty cool statement. God must have given it to me. Because I couldn't have come up with it. But here it is. If you have opposition in your life, if it seems like everything is being thrown at you, one thing right after another, here's what you need to do. You need to stop and you need to look for God. Because I believe that wherever Satan is attacking, God is getting ready to do something in your life. Because you see, Satan's number one goal is to stop God in you. Satan does not want you to give God praise for the things that have happened in your life. He does not want God to get credit. He wants you to give credit to yourself. You were able to pay that bill because your boss gave you a bonus. That's why you were able to do it. Really? Or was it because you faithfully tithe no matter what your bills look like? And God says, be faithful to me and I will be faithful to you. Could that have been the reason? If you have opposition, stop and look for God. I promise you, God is getting ready to do something in your life. Number 2, in cultivating hope, hold on to the promises of God because God is in the details. One of the things I love to do when I've gone through a struggle is to go back and look at where God was working. Because so many times in the struggle, we're so blinded by the struggle that we can't see how God is working and moving in our life. But a lot of times, I've been able to stop and look back and see, wow, God brought this person into my life that help me to get through this. And God ordered this person to, kind of come into my life when I haven't talked to them forever. And all of these things just happen to align and work. You see, the prophet Isaiah, he prophesied 200 years before King Cyrus was born. 200 years before King Cyrus was ever born, before the Israelites were ever taken captive to Babylon, and Isaiah prophesied that King Cyrus would release the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Now, think about that 70 years in exile. Now does your hope feel a little bit different? The God that they worshiped had sent a person to tell them, do not fear, because your time in exile will be short. It will not be forever. You will go back to Jerusalem. You will rebuild what was destroyed. But do you think some still gave up hope? Do you think everyone believed? So King Darius, the last letter that was sent to him, it's good. I love his reply. Here's his reply to these Samaritan opposers. He says, let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid. And then he gives the specifics of how it should be laid. And the costs are to be paid by the royal treasury. Also, the gold and silver articles that Nebuchadnezzar stole from Jerusalem, give them back. Because it belongs to them. Give it back to them. He goes on and says, do not interfere with the work of this temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I hereby decree what you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of God. Are you hearing that? Not only are you to let them do it, you're going to help them do it. You're not excited yet, so I'll keep going. Okay. Their expenses are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury from the revenues of the Trans-Euphrates. Guess who has control of the treasury of the Trans-Euphrates? The Samaritans. So not only are you going to help them do it, you're going to pay for it. You'll eventually get excited so that the work will not stop. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs, and burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat and salt and wine and olive oil, as requested by the priests in Jerusalem, must be given to them daily without fail, so that they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. So not only are you going to do everything, but that God that you're trying to stop, I'm familiar with that God, and just to let you know, you can't stop him. So just let them worship their God. But if you don't, furthermore, I decree that if anyone defies this edict, a beam is to be pulled from their house, and they are to be impaled on it. And for this crime, their house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or to destroy this temple in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have decreed it, and let it be carried out with diligence. God is in the details. Said for you in American language, God's got your back. But maybe that's not enough for you to see that God's in the details. So Xerxes, that king that sent that first letter and said, stop the people from rebuilding. Well, you see, Xerxes had a thing for pretty women. And his queen kind of, let him down a little bit. So he needed a new queen. And so he had all the prettiest ladies in the countryside come, and he was going to handpick his next queen. And guess who he handpicks? Esther. Guess who Xerxes didn't know that she was? A Jew! He wouldn't have married her if he knew that she was a Jew. And so Mordecai, who is one of the Jewish leaders and an uncle to Esther, encourages Esther that you need to go and you need to talk to your king because our people are being killed by the king's right-hand man. You need to step out in faith and protect your people. So what does she do? She goes and she invites herself into the presence of the king. That's immediate death. You don't go in front of the king unless you're invited in front of the king, even if you're the queen. So the queen walks in, and the king says, whatever you want, up to a certain percentage of my kingdom. And so she reveals her identity. She reveals who she is. And the Jews now have power in the Gentile kingdom. Mordecai is elevated to a high position within the king's court. And it just so happens that there's another king that's coming down the line, and his name is Artaxerxes. Well, guess who Artaxerxes just happens to be? The stepson of Esther. And Artaxerxes sends Ezra to Jerusalem from Babylon with the mission of teaching the Jewish people how to worship their God properly. Because they're not doing it all that well. They had actually started intermarrying, and that's a no-no in the Jewish culture. They had begun defiling the God that got them where they were. And so the king, the pagan king, if you will, sends Ezra on the mission of teach these people how to worship. Help get worship going again in Jerusalem. But then God puts in the heart of another young leader in Babylon named Nehemiah. Nehemiah has his heart broken because this beautiful temple has now been rebuilt, but there's no walls to protect the city. And if there's walls that cannot protect the city, what's going to stop the temple of God from being destroyed again? So that, king called Artaxerxes sends Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of the city. God is in the details. Number 3, know that hope is not influenced by your past. Some of us may be tempted to look at our past and say, why would I have hope? Because having hope in something means that I believe I can be better than my past. But you see, hope is focused on the future, not what's behind you. It's focused on the future. So many times we look at our life and we throw up our hands and say, it's impossible. I can't be any better. I'm never going to have a job that provides for my family. I'm never going to be able to beat this depression in my life. I'm never going to overcome this addiction. This is just who I am. Is it? It is if that's what you're cultivating. If that's the seed you're putting in your ground, then that's what you're going to get. But if you focus on what's ahead, and what's ahead is only in the hands of one person, God. He's the only one who knows what will happen in the future. He holds the whole future in his hands. Number 4. So how do we restore hope in lives of people in our community? We build relationships with people. We care for people. We love people. We walk alongside them when they hurt, and we celebrate with them when they rejoice. Job had everything. He had wealth, health. He had everything a man could want. He had a beautiful wife. His family had grown. His family was growing. He had friends. He had everything. But even faster than he got all those things, it was taken away from him. And here are his friends and their reactions. Eliphaz started out by affirming Job and said, yeah, you've been a good source of strength for other people. But then he immediately started blaming Job for all of Job's problems. Then his other friend boldly joined the chorus of certainty that death and destruction couldn't have touched Job unless he was at fault. Zophar didn't want to be left out, so he assumed the cause of Job's problems were due to some sort of secret sin in Job's life, and he needed to repent of that sin so that he could be restored. Oh, that beautiful wife of his that he was so blessed to have, she had given up hope. She had given up on God. And she told Job, with great womanly advice, why don't you just curse God and die? So glad I married her. You see, when you go through difficult times, you better have people who have hope in their own lives in your corner. When women have gone through a divorce and you're struggling with your marriage and your marriage is in shambles, let me ask you this. Do your friends come around you and start adding to your story? Yeah, he's worthless. He's not worth your time. Or do they turn it and say, how have you contributed to the problem? Have you gone to counseling with them? Have you done everything that you can do for this relationship before you just give up? Because there's a difference, and only one of them is called a friend. It's not the one that joins in and starts bashing the person because that's what you're doing. That's not supporting them. It's actually hurting them. Because if that woman doesn't grow from what she did in that relationship, how she contributed to the potential problems, and let me clarify, not every situation of divorce is always that person's to blame for everything and nothing on someone else. There are, you know that. There's a difference. Here's what I believe about hope. Hope should draw us to action. Because of the hope that we have in our lives, we should be able to say, I don't have a problem stepping out in faith in this because I know who my God is. Some of the bravest people I have ever watched battle cancer are the people who are followers of Christ that say, you know what? Cancer does not have the last say in my life. Cancer can kill me, but cancer will not win because God's already won. Cancer can kill me, but that just means my party begins in heaven with Jesus. And eternal life begins. The things that come against us, that opposition, does not get the last say in our lives. God does. Let me ask you this. Where, what, and or who are you looking to for hope? Are you looking to your job for hope? Are you looking to your spouse for hope? You may love them, and you can love them all you want, but I promise you they will fail you at some point in your life. I'm not even saying they're going to set out with that agenda. I am going to fail that person. No. It's called human. Is it in you? Is your hope in your ability to do something? What happens when you can't do it anymore? What do you put your hope in? If your hope is in anything but God, it will fail you. What determines whether or not you are hopeful or not? Is it your circumstances? Or is it your God who promises the end result? What is it? So how do we restore hope in a community? I can tell you really easy. You show people what it looks like to live for Jesus. When you struggle, you struggle. None of this, hey, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm doing great. Miserable. Your cat just got ran over. Life's horrible. But nope, everything's perfect. Just got diagnosed with cancer yesterday, but I'm smiling today. No! Live who you are. If your life is in shambles, let people support you. Let people rally around you. And the people who aren't rallying around you, guess what? They're not your friends. They're not your family. Your life has just been blessed by the curse. Because that curse showed you who the real people are that love you. And now you know, I never want to be like those people who left me. I want to be the kind of friend that my friends are to me, to everyone else. Show people the love of Christ. And we will restore hope, not in the church, not in us, but in God. You should reach out your hands and receive this blessing. Jesus, I pray over these people that you would do it again. Because we didn't see it the first time. We need to do it in slow-mo again so that we can see you moving in our lives. God, I pray that you will help us to leave this place full of hope. And not the desire and wishful thinking type of hope, but a confident assurance that our God is with us today. That our God is with us in the struggles, that our God is with us in the celebration of life. God, may we know today that you are the God of all hope.